In topic 21, we're going to talk about how the Roman Catholic Church spread the faith in new ways in a different world. And what we're talking about here in topic 21 is, in many respects, how the Roman Catholic Church went about spreading Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation and after the Council of Trent. And in fact, we're going to meet two religious orders, the Jesuits and the Ursulines, who are instrumental in helping the Roman Catholic Church spread Roman Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation and after the Council of Trent. Well before the Protestant Reformation and well before the Council of Trent, there were a number of innovations going on in Europe that also affected Roman Catholicism. If you remember, the late medieval period was not a high mark in the history of Roman Catholicism. But things outside of the church, something like Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492, this has a gigantic impact on the Catholic Church and on Christianity in general, because when Columbus sails from Spain over into the Americas, he really does link the Americas with Europe. And now part of the history of Europe is going to be entwined with this history of the Americas. And if you've kept up over the last few years with news articles and scholarly articles about, is Columbus a good guy or a bad guy? I mean, the consensus now is more on the side that, well, he wasn't really a good guy. It wasn't like he was just out there as an explorer and doing this out of curiosity. He really was a colonizer, and the whole point of his exploration of the New World was not just to go and find this New World, which wasn't really new. People had been living there forever and had their own religions and traditions, etc. And it wasn't just to go and find a trade route to India. It was to go over there and find gold. In fact, what a lot of people don't realize is when Columbus met the people in the New World for Columbus, that had been there for centuries, one of the first things he wrote in his diary is that these people have gold and they would make good slaves. But not to downplay this side of what Columbus did. I mean, this was really the beginning of European colonization of the Americas. Columbus really did link two histories, and that link is going to change not just how the Roman Catholic Church, but Christianity in general is going to think and do evangelical missionary activity. I should point out, because sometimes he isn't mentioned enough, that a Dominican named Bartolomé de las Casas was instrumental in fighting back against Columbus and this whole program of let's go colonize the New World, let's go take the gold from the Aztecs and the Mayans and so on and so forth, and let's enslave the Indians. Las Casas wrote a number of accounts saying this is wrong, the church shouldn't do this, the church shouldn't support this, the Spanish government should not be okay with this. In fact, if you go down to Mexico City today, a lot of young artists that through their art talk about what Columbus did. Columbus is really the enemy in the art, and then Las Casas is the great hero. So if you ever have a chance to read more about Las Casas, I would really recommend doing that, because he is, in many respects, one of the great founders of a Catholic movement known as liberation theology, which grows in the 20th century and is a type of Catholic theology that comes out of Latin America. But a lot of the 20th century Latin American Roman Catholic theologians who practice liberation theology will say, well, no, its roots go all the way back to Las Casas criticizing Columbus for what he was doing and criticizing the Spanish Empire. But I just want to point that out, because Las Casas is really one of the great voices that's often forgotten in Roman Catholic Church history. But Columbus does, despite how one judges him, a colonizer or an explorer, does really link the European world now to this newly discovered world for the Europeans, the Americas. And something else that really affects Roman Catholicism, and perhaps even more directly, is that after the Protestant Reformation, Catholics have to ask themselves, particularly Catholic religious orders, How in the world do we go about converting people now that there is something else that is Christian that we have to compete with? And this may sound somewhat odd, but basically what religious orders in the Catholic Church are now having to do is they're having to ask themselves, how do we work on converting the people who were already baptized at home? And this, what I mean by this is you have a couple of things going on. First of all, Catholicism wants to reach out to Protestants and tell Protestants, if you don't want to be Protestant, you want to come back to the Catholic Church. Or if you grew up and never knew Catholicism and you're a Protestant and that's all you've ever been, you need to come over to us, be baptized as a Catholic, so on and so forth. But the other problem is that a lot of Catholics realize that the Protestant Reformation happened because the clergy in the Catholic Church were so uneducated, the laity in the Catholic Church were so uneducated, they really didn't know the doctrines and the beliefs and the dogmas of the Catholic Church. So the idea was, well, we have all these Catholics in Europe, but they still don't understand their faith. So how do we go back and actually convert those who are already part of the church? How do we get them to really understand Roman Catholicism and what it means to be a Catholic as opposed to being a Protestant? And of course, you see this down to this day. I mean, I see this all the time as an educator in a Roman Catholic college, that when I go to Mass over at St. Joseph's on Edwards Street, I see a lot of people who, and not just that parish, it'd be almost any parish, I see a lot of people that are simply, and I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but they're going through the motions because this is what they've been taught to do, and so they're saying the prayers that they say, they're saying the creeds that they say, they're performing Mass in ways that it's always been done, but they don't really know why they do what they do. They don't really have an explanation behind why they believe the things that they believe. It's just what they've been told. Well, this was, of course, going on back after the Protestant Reformation. It became a challenge to the Catholic Church. So two religious orders, one a male order and then one an all-female order, came along trying to address this problem. Now, there are other orders that tried to address this problem, but I'm going to just focus on these two. First of all, we have the Jesuits. This is an all-male order that after the Protestant Reformation comes about and really takes on this task of how do we convert those in the church who have already been baptized? How do we educate the laity? How do we educate the clergy? And what you have here is a picture of the founder of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola, his years are 1491 to 1556. Ignatius was a former military man, and so he took a lot of his military experience with him over into setting up the Jesuits and how the hierarchy of the Jesuits would be run. And by the way, the Pope today, Pope Francis, is a Jesuit Pope. This is kind of a rarity of a Pope coming out of the Jesuit line. And Jesuits today have a number of really, really important, prominent, good universities out there, Catholic universities out there in the world. But because Ignatius of Loyola was a military man, his crew, his followers, other Jesuits were often called his company. And obviously you can see this is coming out of his military background. There's all kinds of misconceptions about Ignatius of Loyola because of the fact that he was once upon a time a military man. But it's important to realize that in a battle, one day he ended up having a conversion experience after a cannonball literally blew through both of his legs. And when he was convalescing in a hospital, the story goes, there was nothing for him to read except, wouldn't you know it, a copy of the Lives of the Saints. And so here this very rich young man, there's such a theme here of this when you think back to Francis of Assisi, Dominic Guzman, and now Ignatius of Loyola, of these rich young men having these conversion experiences where they give up the rich life, in this case the rich life and the military life, while Ignatius is reading in the hospital the lives of the saints, it totally changes his life. It has an impact on him, and he decides, I in a sense, want to be a soldier of Christ and not a soldier of some empire or some country. And so he takes that kind of mentality with him and says, I'm going to use this to start a new group, to organize a group that will go out there and educate Catholics on their faith, convert those who have already been baptized. So the Jesuits were essentially formed to do whatever the Pope asked them to do. They sometimes, I think wrongly, were kind of seen as the police force of the Pope or the protectors of the Pope, and that's not quite the case, but they are certainly there to do the Pope's bidding. Sometimes when you hear them called the police force of the Pope or things like that, again, it's bound up with this idea that Ignatius came out of the military, but in reality he gave those things up when he had his conversion experience. But if you're a Jesuit, even down to this day, you take one extra vow in this religious order. So most religious orders will take 3 vows. They will take the vow of poverty, they will take the vow of chastity, and they will take the vow of obedience. But the 4th vow among the Jesuits is allegiance to the Pope. And what happened is popes started asking the Jesuits to do something that was not all that simple, but it was fairly direct. The order from the Pope was get back as much Protestant territory taken from us as you can. Now, this doesn't mean go out there and wage a war against Protestants. What it means, the directive here is take a well-trained cadre of priests, your company, and educate Catholics. Educate the priests, educate the bishops, etc., etc., etc. And the thought was, if you can get this education out to Catholics, then who are in these Protestant territories, then what you will see is you will see these territories turn back from being Protestant to being Catholic. And in many respects, the Jesuits were unbelievably successful. So if you look at the year 1556, there were only 35 colleges. Think of these more as prep schools, preparatory schools in Europe. But not even 100 years later, 1626, because of the Jesuits, there were 444 of these colleges that were trying to bring people up correctly in the Catholic faith. And all of this is thanks to Loyola, his company, and later Jesuits. And I'll come back to the Jesuits because they weren't just interested in doing missionary work at home in Europe. They were also very, very interested in doing missionary work throughout the rest of the known world. The second group that I want to talk about is the Ursulines. So if the Jesuits were all men, the Ursulines all women. And the founder of the Ursulines is a woman named Angela Merici, 1474 to 1540. And again, you can see here with the dates of Loyola, you could see here with the dates of Angela that their lives interact with secular history. For instance, Columbus discovering or finding or happening upon the New World. Angela starts this group, this religious order known as the Ursulines. And Angela fought, she was a very outspoken woman. She fought against a movement to enclose nuns, what are known as papal enclosures. After Trent, one of the things that happened is there was this attempt by some popes to tell the sisters, to tell the nuns, if you need to stay within your convents, or monks, you need to stay within your monasteries. And this was completely unacceptable to Angela, because Angela thought, I can't do the work that God wants me to do if I am enclosed in a convent. And she, going back, of course, to the Franciscans and to the Dominicans, thought, much like the Jesuits, of we need to be out there with the people. Her great insight, and this was absolutely brilliant, is that it was poor catechesis, poor training of the laity that played the most prominent role in the Protestant Reformation. And some would argue that's kind of still the case in Catholicism today, that when you go through these rites of initiation into the church, when you go through baptism and confirmation and taking your Eucharist, basically that's the only teaching you get as a young Catholic about what this faith is all about. But this is all done by the time you're a teenager, and then what typically happens today in the Catholic Church is you leave the church until you come back and get married. And something similar was going on after the Protestant Reformation, and Angela says we need to stop this. We need to do better at catechizing Catholics, that is, teaching Catholics about the Roman Catholic faith, about the Roman Catholic tradition. It's sad, but often converts to Roman Catholicism, especially adult converts to Roman Catholicism, end up learning more about the Roman Catholic faith than people who grew up in the church. Well, what Angela is thinking here is where Ignatius's insight was to train the rich boys and to do this top-down approach to education, Angela was thinking the exact opposite. She thought that the best thing to do was train young girls, especially poor girls. Her reason for this is that poor girls in general, when they grow up and become women and they have children, if they are trained in the Catholic faith, they will continue to teach that Catholic faith to their kids in the home. And if you look throughout a lot of history, even going back to ancient Israelite history in the Bible, most of the teaching and education of children comes through the mom, comes through women. This was also the case among the Puritans, for instance, in New England, is that what Angela is thinking here is very, very simple. Just educate the women, and then they will educate their kids. They will pass this knowledge on. Don't go just to the men and educate the men, because they will be out there working in the fields or what have you. And if you're Ignatius, you're only getting a certain portion of society, because Ignatius, again, was focused on the more economically well-to-do. Well, to do this, of course, Angela realized the Ursulines cannot be enclosed in a convent. They need to be out there in the world. They need to be moving around. They need to be itinerant, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And eventually, the Catholic hierarchy let the Ursulines do this. But the Ursulines finally make it over to the Americas. And in fact, in the year 1639, there's a very famous Ursuline nun named Marie de l'Incarnation who establishes this very influential presence of the Ursulines in French Canada, in what today would be called the province of Quebec. Well, French Canada becomes a base to convert the rest of the Americas, especially North America. So again, you have this because of Columbus, this linking of Old World, New World. And just to put a lot of this in context for you, let me kind of give you an outline here. Of course, you don't need to remember any of these dates, but just so you can see what's going on here outside of the Jesuits and the Ursulines. Let me give you a couple of dates for some context to set this all in historical perspective for you. So obviously, everybody knows 1492, Columbus. That phrase you hear back in school. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But prior to Columbus, 1487, Bartolomeo Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope around that point there of South Africa. I mean, this is amazing when you think of this going on in the 15th century. Europeans are beginning to explore the rest of the planets, or rest of the planet. 1492, of course, Columbus. It's in 1498. It's not Columbus, but it's Vasco da Gama who finally gets to India. So the world is expanding even more and more. And of course, when Europeans start getting to places like India, they start to encounter people that are not Christian, that are not Jewish, that are not Muslim. They start to encounter Hindus and Buddhists. 1519 to 1522, Magellan circumnavigates the globe. It's actually his crew that ends up completing this task for him, since he dies partway through. 1519 to 1521, Cortez defeats the Aztecs. This is a very sad event, especially in the lives of modern Mexicans. 1609, the French establish an outpost in what today is Quebec. They established that province of Quebec. So all these things, all these great explorations are going on. And these explorations via ship, via crossing the seas, are connected really with the Catholic missionary efforts that are going to happen after the Protestant Reformation. Not just the ones at home, but others that are going to happen. And so while these explorations are going on, the Roman Catholic Church has to really think about, well, what does it mean to export the Roman Catholic faith outside of Europe to some of these other places? What does it mean to take that faith to certain parts of Africa? What does it mean to take it to parts of the Americas? What does it mean to take it to India? Well, in 1537, Pope Paul III proclaims that Indians, and by this he means Mexicans, are human beings and they should be allowed to become Christians. Now, that is a great statement, and it also is a horrible statement at the same time, because you can see some of the Eurocentrism here, and you can certainly see that with a statement like this, that we are starting to see that ugly face of racism rearing its head, which unfortunately is part of both Protestant and Roman Catholic traditions. But there's a big question here. It's a question that we've already seen in the Middle Ages, when the church was moving up into Ireland and was encountering the Celts. The question has to do with evangelization, with missionary activity, of how exactly do you do it? How do you give Christianity to the Indians in South America? How do you give it to the Indians in India? Later on, how do you adapt it, or what do you do when you're presenting Catholicism to the Chinese or to the Japanese? And essentially what's going on here is that question back in the Middle Ages of how much do you allow these groups of people to adapt? How much do you make them throw out? Do they acculturate? Do they assimilate? What do you do, especially if you find practices in their culture, in their religions, that are completely unacceptable to Catholicism? Now, the risk here is always that risk of just turning them into Europeans by making them Catholic. And unfortunately, that often happens with missionary work on both the Catholic and the Protestant side. But after Trent, and certainly with Paul III, the idea was, well, we're going to have to do what we did back in the Middle Ages, of we're going to have to say, no, you don't have to throw everything out. You need to Catholicize certain things. So if you remember, when the Roman Catholics encountered the Celts, well, if they had some place where they were worshiping water, or some source of water that they considered sacred or special, what the Roman Catholic Church did is said, okay, well, let's talk to you about baptism, and let's build a baptistry here. You don't have to give up your sacred spot with water. We just need to Catholicize it by equating this with baptism. Well, Rome realizes that all of its missionary efforts outside of Europe now need to be coordinated. So Rome is sending missionaries out to Asia, to Africa, to the Americas. And perhaps why these missionary efforts are so successful is because of a Roman direction of 1622, which creates a missionary office known as the Propaganda Fidei. Obviously, we get that word propaganda, which has all kinds of negative connotations to it. What that word really means is the propagation or the spreading of the faith. So this office, the Propaganda Fidei, this office established in the 17th century, is the office for the spreading of the faith. And what it's trying to do is coordinate all of the missionary activity of the Roman Catholic Church throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Interestingly, the decision of the Roman Catholic Church and of the Propaganda Fidei is to be very open to the indigenous cultures that Roman Catholic missionaries encounter. In other words, not to go and change those cultures, or to make the indigenous cultures that one encounters European, but to respect them and to see how Catholicism is compatible or may be compatible with these indigenous cultures. The other thing the Propaganda Fidei realizes is that we need as quickly as possible to get indigenous clergy to work among the indigenous cultures that we're trying to evangelize. So, for instance, if you're in China, well, what you want very, very quickly is an indigenous Chinese priest to help spread the Roman Catholic faith throughout China. This doesn't need to necessarily be done by white Europeans. Well, as much as this is supposed to move gradually and work slowly over time, there are some bad things that we just need to point out about some of these missionary efforts. And this is, I'm talking about the Roman Catholic side of this. Many of these stories also exist on the Protestant side. So no one is free here of error or mistakes. Unfortunately, a lot of these missionary efforts, even though they were supposed to be respectful, were not. They were also very heavy-handed. And yes, slavery was a large part of all of this. Think back to Las Casas, who has to criticize the church, he has to criticize Columbus, he has to criticize the Spanish government in the treatment of the Indians in South America. Unfortunately, Franciscans, as much as they loved nature and come across as peace-loving individuals, emphasizing the evangelical life and poverty, sometimes ended up having a very militaristic approach to evangelization, much like the Dominicans during the Spanish Inquisition. If you wouldn't convert, they were by all means going to make you convert. They were going to force you to convert. The Jesuits, very sadly, when they came over to the Americas, held slaves and had slaves do a lot of the menial manual labor for them. In 1640 in Peru, there were these things known as idolatry inspections sanctioned by Rome. In other words, if you were not living up to the true Catholic faith, sort of the police force, the religious police force would come around and stop you or destroy your idolatrous altars, things like that. In fact, it got so bad that there's an account of one Mayan in South America praying for Jesus' return, not so much because he wants to see Jesus, because his hope is that when Jesus returns, he will throw out the Spanish who are persecuting the Mayans, even though many of these Mayans are Christian and the Spanish are also supposed to be Christian. So as you can see here, there's that European Eurocentrism, that European racism, that xenophobia of looking down on the South Americans because they're not white Europeans. Well, to just give you one case study of missionary activity after the Protestant Reformation, I want to talk briefly about the Jesuits in China. Believe it or not, China and Japan were at one point, especially Japan, Christian countries. There's a long history to all of this that we don't have time to go into, but it is worth on your own, perhaps at some point, Googling or reading on Wikipedia, even though I shouldn't tell you to do that. But it is worth kind of, looking at this era in Christian history that some people often forget. But the Jesuits weren't just interested in staying at home. They were really interested in missionary activity. and in particular a Jesuit known as Matteo Ricci. S.J., by the way, if you ever see that after the name of a person in the Catholic Church, that means they are a Jesuit. S.J. stands for the Society of Jesus. But Ricci, who lived from 1552 to 1610, he was a Jesuit priest that was very enamored with going to China and evangelizing China. In fact, he realizes that the way you do this is the Jesuit priest must become a Chinese sage. And I'll explain that here in a second. And this, there were very different reactions to this thinking of Ricci, of a Jesuit priest becoming a Chinese sage. But the Jesuits had been interested in China for a long time. In 1552, a very famous Jesuit named Francis Xavier dies off the coast of China. He doesn't quite get there, but he's on his way there, and he sees China as the place we as Jesuits need to go. It's the next place we need to evangelize. But it's in 1583 that Ricci actually gets the Jesuits there. And what happens is he starts almost immediately to see these connections between Christianity and the indigenous religion of China, Confucianism. Confucianism, which goes back largely to the 6th century BC, puts a priority on things like ancestor worship, ideas about heaven and an omniscient God. It doesn't entirely go there, but it's moving in that direction. It has a predisposition to the idea of monotheism, the belief in one God, and many of the ethical values Ricci realized in Confucianism are very, very similar to the ideas of morality in Christianity and in Catholicism. But if you take ancestor worship, for instance, one might wonder, well, how in the world do you see a connection between Confucianism and ancestor worship and then Christianity? Well, it was very simple for Ricci. He said, well, we have a concept of saints in the Roman Catholic Church that we pray to. And perhaps there is a connection between ancestor worship or praying to your ancestors in Confucianism and then praying to the saints in Catholicism. So this is how Ricci tries to reach the Chinese. And here's a famous portrait of Ricci, and you can sort of see this combination of Jesuit priest here, but a Jesuit priest who's also dressed like a Confucian Chinese sage. And this is what Catholicism was really thinking of. We don't have to tell the indigenous people of China or anywhere else, dress like Europeans, become Europeans. What we need to do is find places where we can connect and compromise. Well, there was, back in Rome, a lot of ambivalence to all of this, to what Ricci and so many others were doing. In 1603, the Jesuits in China officially permitted ancestor worship and honors for Confucius. They didn't see this as all that big of a deal. The way you would explain this is just simply that, well, ancestor worship is like praying to the saints. So it's no big deal whatsoever. And it's still okay, even though we are here trying to evangelize the Chinese and bring them into the Catholic Church, it's still okay for them to honor Confucius because a lot of his teachings are similar to the teachings of Jesus. This would also be the case when the Catholic missionary groups encounter Buddhists. A lot of the teachings of the Buddha are very similar to the teachings of Jesus. So you can honor Confucius, not worship Confucius or see Confucius as the Son of God, but you can honor him. In fact, Pope Paul V, 1605 to 1621, approves Mass being celebrated in Chinese. I mean, this is just unbelievably spellbinding for the 17th century because nobody anywhere else is celebrating the Mass in the vernacular. Everybody is celebrating the Mass in Latin. But if you're in China, there's a special dispensation of it is okay for the Mass to be celebrated in Chinese. In fact, there is a special dispensation that is often not discussed when it comes to Chinese Catholics in China today. Officially, the church is against contraception, but in China, because the government will not allow the Chinese to have more than 2 kids under penalty of law and penalty of death for any kids beyond 2 kids. Rome has said, well, there should be special circumstances in certain cases for the use of contraception in China because of the rules of the government. But after Paul V in 1645, Rome turns around and condemns ancestor worship, even though it was okay with it for a while. In 1656, Alexander VII rescinds and approves the Jesuit strategies in China and says what you guys are doing is fine. But you hit Clement XI, 1700 to 1721, and he ends up condemning ancestor worship. This just goes back and forth and back and forth. And finally, in 1745, Benedict the 16th prohibits Chinese rites and says, no, you can't do this at all anymore. That the Roman Catholic Mass in China can't be in Chinese. It has to go back to being in Latin. So what we're seeing here is we are seeing Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation coinciding with all the other developments going on in Europe, exploration, etc. And Roman Catholicism is asking itself after the Protestant Reformation, okay, what do we do now? How do we implement the reforms of the Council of Trent? How do we get on board with this program of exploration? And in a sense, they're also asking, how do we compete with the Protestants? If the Protestants are going to go on missionary trips to all these places, we have to go too, and we have to figure out how to do this as Catholics.